It's now a bit over a year that I started to show my sewing process here on YouTube. We made some dresses and capes together, and along the way I got a lot of questions about my work in general, my studio materials or techniques, and I was never really able to address them because it didn't really fit into my usual videos. But now we're starting a little series where once in a while a video comes out where I will be talking about those themes, showing more in-depth insights of my work and answer your questions. Something I learned while making dresses is that having the right tools makes the sewing process a lot easier. You can achieve amazing outcomes with the most basic tools, but the more you customize those tools to your workflow and needs, the more effortless it will get for you to achieve nice outcomes. One thing that makes sewing a lot easier, especially when you are draping your own patterns, is to have a nice mannequin. Even better when it got the right measurements to begin with. It saves a lot of time when you can drape the pattern on the mannequin, and it's more accessible when you want to see the fit all around the design. So I tried my hand at building my own mannequins pretty early into my sewing adventures. Over the last year I noticed that I tend to work on 3 different projects at once, so it would be helpful to have that many mannequins. I currently have these 2, so I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to show you how I make one. As the base, I'm using a cheap dress form. I prefer to start with one that's a tiny bit smaller than me. I want the dress form to have a similar silhouette as well as measurements as me, so this is a good starting point. To get the dress form to the right measurements, we need a bit of foam. I'm using the one that is usually made for upholstery, so it's a bit denser. I also got a bit of bra foam this time, which I'm not sure if I'm going to use. Then I got some thin cotton wool, and finally the fabric I want the mannequin to be covered in. Since my 2 other dress forms are white, I wanted this one to match, so I chose a white cotton twill. It is a sturdy fabric but not too stiff, and handles seat good if I want to iron something directly on the dress form, for example. Other than that, we need some mock-up fabric and a few sewing supplies, and we can start with the mannequin. Since we are doing a dress form mimicking my body, we have to first find out the measurements we have to work with. I'm also taking the same measurements from the mannequin so that I can compare them to see how much I have to change later. I'm alternating between my body and the mannequin while measuring to make sure to measure the same way both times. Not only do I want the dress form to have my measurements, I also want it to behave similarly, which means I want it to be softer at some places so that the waist can be squeezed the same way, for example. Because of that, I took some measurements on myself 2 times, once the exact measurement and the second time as tight as possible. This way I will know later in the process how much foam I have to add at some places. After taking all the measurements, I made a mock-up of how I want the mannequin cover to look like. I used the pattern of one of my previous mannequins with similar measurements. Since I wanted the design to look a bit different, especially at the bust area, I changed those things on a new pattern. Using this, I could then transfer all the pattern pieces onto the fabric. I prefer to use one big sheet for the pattern at this point because I got a better overview over all the changes while making the mock-ups. To see this big pattern sheet through my mock-up fabric, I usually put a white paper underneath. This way the contrast of the pattern lines is high enough so that it is easily visible through the fabric. With this little trick it is very easy to transfer the pattern precisely onto the fabric. After drawing all the pattern pieces, making sure to add the right seam allowance to each piece, I could then cut them out. When a project is made from so many pieces, I prefer to lay them all on my table, how they belong together, and then always fold 2 pieces onto each other that will be sewn together then. Making a mock-up is not only helpful to determine the fit, but also how to approach the making of the actual piece later. For example, I like to test out how to iron difficult seams open. Especially with curved seams, and even though the fabric doesn't act exactly like the right fabric later, it's still a nice help with the approach works best. The last step on the mock-up was to add a zipper because it made the fitting process a lot easier. I know that with adding the zipper, the mock-up is a few millimeters bigger than the pattern. But since the mock-up needs to fit around me, while the actual piece later should reflect my body, this should be fine. I was very happy with the fit of the mock-up, especially with the back, and felt like I only needed a bit more room around the bust and a bit less room around the hips. I also lowered the waistline a bit. Then I drew the changes onto the pattern, making sure to use a different colored pen so that I knew exactly when I did which change to the pattern. Since the changes were so minor, I decided that I could directly start with the cover for the dress form. The next step was then to prepare the fabric for the cover. And then I could start to transfer the pattern onto the fabric. Since it is a white fabric, I could use the same technique as before. Here I transferred all the pieces from one side, added the seam allowance, and then turned the pattern paper to trace all the pieces for the other side. This way I have all the lines on all pieces and I can sew them very easily. A little rule for myself is that as soon as I have to concentrate on which pattern piece is which while drawing, I directly have to mark them in some way. The front here is pretty easy, but with all those similar looking back pieces, it saves a lot of thinking when I just mark them while drawing each piece. After cutting out all the pieces and with the experience from sewing the test piece, I could then sew all the pieces of the cover together pretty quick. The only thing I still had to think about was how I wanted to finish the seams. I wanted them to be a bit more noticeable and sturdy, so I decided against ironing the seams open. Instead, I ironed the seams to one side and sewed over the seam allowance. I wanted to add an invisible zipper to the back of the cover, so I prepared the center back pieces by sewing all the pattern pieces together and could then add the zipper to those small panels. After that, I had to add the back panels to the rest of the cover and put it onto the mannequin for the first time. Depending on how big the differences of your measurements and the base dress form are, it is possible that the cover doesn't fit at this point, but since here the measurements were pretty similar, I could put it on for a first look. This way I could directly see where the measurements are different and where I had to actually take something away from the dress form. Since I noticed that the neck and shoulder area were almost identical, I could make the pattern for the neck at this point, otherwise it would be done later. Here I simply traced the shape of the neck onto some tape and cut the pattern from this. After transferring it onto the fabric, I could sew it together and add it to the cover. And then it was time to take a closer look at the mannequin itself. I put on some gloves and covered up my table because the dress form was very old and lost a lot of crumbs while handling it. I also didn't like how it felt on my hands at all, which you could maybe tell by the look on my face later on. But since I knew I would cover it up later, I wasn't too concerned about it. After removing the current cover, I first started to take away a lot of material around the bust. Not only was it very fragile at that area caused by some fall damage, I think, but I also wanted it to be a bit softer there so that I could later put dresses with different bust shapes onto it. That's why next up I used the foam to cut out some pieces and gave it a rounder shape. I started off with a very rough outline, measured it and slowly shaped it closer to the final measurement. A few times I added the cover over it to see how close the fit is and where I had to take something away or add more foam. When the cover was on the mannequin, I always took some pictures that I could then use as a reference when I was cutting the foam again. This way I got closer and closer to the final form. Once I was happy with the overall shape, I tried to smooth out the added foam as much as possible by thinning the edges, adding small foam pieces in between, and finally by covering the bigger areas with pieces of the bra foam. I ended up using one panel of the upholstery foam and one from the bra foam, but this will probably depend on how different your shape is compared to the mannequin. Then I added the cotton wool to smooth it out even further and put the initial cover over it as well. Since it is very stretchy, it fitted around the different measurements and I could use it to hold everything together better. Then I added the new cover and smoothed it out as much as possible. The only thing left to do is now to cover the armholes as well as the bottom. First, I started to add a sturdy gathering thread to the bottom of the cover. After making sure all the seams are straight and the cover is pulled down as much as possible, I pulled the thread and tied it. This way the bottom is secured. Then I closed the armholes. It is possible to close them directly while sewing the cover, but I like to do it this way because it is easier and more adjustable. Again, I used a gathering thread, but spacing it smaller this time to accommodate the curve. Then I could directly take the pattern from there and prepare a fabric piece to sew over the hole. After pinning it to the correct spot, I hand sewed it in place and did the same on the other side. The bottom was closed the same way. And now the dress form is finished. I know it's not as accurate as those that scan your body, for example, but in my experience this is more than enough for a mannequin fitting your measurements to create fitting patterns on it. The other two I made before are a few years old now and I can work with them perfectly every day. I'm especially happy how it behaves like my body does, with being harder at some places and then softer at others. I think using an existing dress form as the base and then customize it makes this pretty easy to achieve. Buying all the supplies, including a basic mannequin, costs around 80 euros, which is way more affordable than buying a mannequin made to your measurements. I hope you liked this type of video, and if you are interested in other parts of my studio or work and would like to see a video about it, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and until next time.